This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Today, we will spend the rest of the hour unraveling one of the great mysteries of the Vietnam War era. On March 8, 1971, a group of 8 activists, including a cab driver, a daycare director, and 2 professors, broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole every document they found. The activists, calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, soon began leaking shocking details about FBI abuses to the media. Among the documents was one that bore the mysterious word COINTELPRO.
No one involved in the break-in was ever caught. Their identities remained a secret until this week. Today, 3 of the FBI burglars will join us on the show. But first, I want to turn to a new short film produced by the nonprofit news organization Retro Report for the New York Times. It's titled Stealing J. Edgar Hoover's Secrets.
It's the greatest heist you've never heard of, and one of the most important.
Last March, someone broke into the FBI offices in Media, Pennsylvania, stole some records, and mailed copies of them around to several newspapers.
Those records would help bring an end to J. Edgar Hoover's secret activities within the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
He ordered his agents not only to expose New Left groups, but to take action against them to neutralize them.
Many Americans were tapped and bugged, had their mail opened by the CIA and the FBI.
The burglars were never caught, and the details have remained a mystery until now. A new book, The Burglary, reveals for the first time who did it and how they used a crowbar to pry open one of the best-kept and darkest secrets in American history.
We were early whistleblowers before whistleblowers were known as such.
The burglars are stepping out of the shadows just as new revelations about secret intelligence operations have many people asking, how much is too much when personal privacy is at stake? In the spring of 1970, the war in Vietnam was raging.
American battle deaths in Vietnam now number 40,142.
And at home, anti-war protesters and law enforcement officers were violently clashing.
It felt like a nightmare was unfolding. I took what was outrage and horror about what was going on, and I realized that I had to take it somewhere.
Bonnie Raines worked at a daycare center in Philadelphia. Her husband, John, taught religion at Temple University. They were the very picture of a golden couple.
We had an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old. We were family folks who also wanted to keep another track active in our lives, which was political activism.
That activism attracted the attention of the FBI. Its director, the powerful and feared J. Edgar Hoover, perceived the anti-war movement, which ranged from radical revolutionaries to peaceful protesters, as a threat to national security.
At one rally, I had one of my children on my back, and not only did they take my picture, but they took her picture.
Protesters like the Raines became increasingly convinced the FBI was conducting a covert campaign against them, tapping their phones and infiltrating anti-war groups.
We knew the FBI was systematically trying to squash dissent, and dissent is the lifeblood of democracy.
Determined to get proof the FBI was crossing the line, fellow activist and Haverford physics professor William Davidon hatched a plan. He reached out to the Raines and 6 others, including a social worker, a graduate student, and a taxi driver named Keith Forsyth.
We agreed to meet someplace where we could talk. And he says, what would you think about the idea of breaking into an FBI office? And I look at him, and I'm like, you're serious, aren't you? I was pretty vehement in my opposition to the war, and I felt like marching up and down the street with a sign was not cutting it anymore. And it was like, okay, time to kick it up a notch.
The crew decided to break into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania.
Once I got over the shock of thinking that this was the nuttiest thing I'd ever heard in my life, I'm like, this is a great idea, because we're not going to make any allegations. We're going to take their own paperwork signed by their own people, including J. Edgar Hoover, and give it to the newspapers. So let's see you argue with that.
In the Raines' third-floor attic, the team divvied up responsibilities and assigned tasks. They hung maps to learn about the neighborhood, planned escape routes, and they took extensive notes on the comings and goings in the building.
I signed up for a correspondence course in locksmithing. That was my job, to get us in the door. Practiced several times a week. After a month, you get pretty good.
Bonnie was assigned the job of going inside and casing the office.
I was to call the office and make an appointment as a Swarthmore student, doing research on opportunities for women in the FBI. So they gave me an appointment. I tried to disguise myself as best I could, and I went to say goodbye, and I acted confused about where the door was, and that gave me a chance then to check out both rooms and know where the file cabinets were.
Bonnie discovered there was no alarm system and no security guards. She also found a second door leading inside.
When she came back with that news, we became convinced, yes, I think we can get this done. We had more to lose than anybody else in the group because we had these kids.
We faced the reality of if we were arrested and on trial, we would be in prison for very many years. We had to make some plans for that.
With a solid understanding of how they would conduct the break-in, they now needed to figure out when.
15 rounds.
March 8, 1971, Fraser and Ali were fighting for the championship of the world. And we had the feeling that maybe the cops might be a little bit distracted.
While the crew waited at a nearby hotel, Forsyth arrived at the office alone.
Pull up, walk up to the door, and one of the locks is a cylinder tumbler lock, not a pin tumbler lock. And I just about had a heart attack. Bottom line is I could not pick that lock.
They almost called it off, but that second door that Bonnie noticed gave them another chance.
At that point, you know that you're going to have to wing it. Knelt down on the floor, picked the lock in like 20 seconds. There was a deadbolt on the other side. I had a pry bar with me, a short crowbar. I put the bar in there and yanked that sucker. At one point, I heard a noise inside the office. And I'm like, are they in there waiting for me? Basically said to myself, there's only one way to find out. I'm going in.
Next, the inside crew walked into an empty office wearing business suits and carrying several suitcases. They cleaned out file cabinets and then made their way downstairs to the getaway car and drove off unnoticed. The group reconvened at a farmhouse an hour's drive away and started unpacking.
We were like, oh man, I can't believe this worked. We knew there was going to be some gold in there somewhere.
Each of the 8 of us were sorting files, and all of a sudden, you'd hear one of them, oh, look at this one, look.
After several long nights digging for documents that looked the most revealing, the burglars sent copies to journalists, including Washington Post reporter Betty Medsger.
The cover letter was from the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. And the first file that I read was about a group of FBI agents who were told to enhance the paranoia in the anti-war movement and to create an atmosphere that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox.
Attorney General John Mitchell asked the Post not to write about the stolen documents, saying it could endanger lives.
The Attorney General called 2 key editors and tried to convince them not to publish.
But the Post did publish the story on the front page. It was the first of several reports and told how agents turned local police, letter carriers, and switchboard operators into informants.
There were very strong editorials calling for an investigation of the FBI.
Another stolen document would prove even more explosive, a routing slip marked with a mysterious word, COINTELPRO. While reporters tried to uncover its meaning, the FBI was desperate to find the burglars. The Bureau put nearly 200 agents on the investigation. Hoover's best lead was the college girl who had visited their office.
His command was, find me that woman.
Agents actively searched for Bonnie, but there were many anti-war activists who fit her description.
We could hide within thousands of people. There were so many of us who were active.
The documents prove...
2 years later, NBC reporter Carl Stern figured out the meaning of that word, COINTELPRO.
Secret FBI memos made public today show that the late J. Edgar Hoover ordered a nationwide campaign to disrupt the activities of the New Left without telling any of his superiors about it.
Many of the techniques were clearly illegal. Burglaries, forged blackmail letters, and threats of violence were used.
The FBI initially defended its actions.
The government would have been derelict in its duty had it not taken measures to protect the fabric of our society.
But the Bureau's techniques were worse, and the targets more far-reaching than the burglars ever imagined.
Diplomats, government employees, sports figures, socially prominent persons, senators, and congressmen. The FBI at one time sought to blackmail the late Martin Luther King into committing suicide.
Marriages were destroyed. Violence was encouraged. Many Americans were tapped and bugged, had their mail opened by the CIA and the FBI, and their tax returns used illegally.
An extended excerpt from Stealing J. Edgar Hoover's Secrets, a short film produced by Retro Report for the New York Times. To watch the full video, visit retroreport.org. When we come back, 3 of the activists join us in studio. Keith Forsyth, Bonnie, and John Raines, as well as the former Washington Post reporter Betty Medsger, who first broke the story of the stolen FBI documents in 1971. This week, she revealed the identities of the burglars in her new book, The Burglary, the discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI. We'll go back in time and talk about today as well. This is Democracy Now!, back in a moment. Spy for the FBI, the 1966 classic by J.Mo Thomas and his Party Brothers Orchestra. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Joining us now in our studio are 3 of the activists who broke into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania on March 8, 1971. The break-in led to revelations about the FBI's secret COINTELPRO program that targeted activists across the country. None of the burglars were ever caught. On Tuesday, their identities were revealed for the very first time. Keith Forsyth, Bonnie Raines, and John Raines all lived in Philadelphia in 1971. Forsyth was working as a cab driver. He was chosen to pick the lock at the FBI office. Bonnie and John Raines hosted many of the planning meetings for the burglaries at their home where they were raising 3 children. Bonnie, who worked as a daycare director, helped case the FBI office by posing as a college student interested in becoming an FBI agent. John Raines was a veteran of the Freedom Rides movement and a professor at Temple University. He used a Xerox machine at the school to photocopy many of the stolen documents.
We're also joined by Betty Medsger, author of the new book, The Burglary, the discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI. Medsger first reported on the stolen documents while working at the Washington Post. She uncovered the identities of most of the burglars in her new book. And we welcome you all to Democracy Now! Keith, I want to begin with you. Talk about the time and how you ended up going into the FBI office. What spurred you on?
So at that time, we had just, within a few years, gone through the sort of peak of the civil rights movement, and many of the laws like the Voting Rights Act had been passed some years before, but the reality of racial justice was still far from complete. There were, the war in Vietnam was raging at that point in time, and so there were many, many people who were working for change in those areas in particular. My main focus at that time was the anti-war movement. I was, spending as much time as I could with organizing against the war, but I had become very frustrated with legal protest. Didn't seem to be getting us anywhere. The government wasn't listening. The war was escalating and not de-escalating. And I think what really pushed me over the edge was shortly after the invasion of Cambodia, there were 4 students killed at Kent State and 2 more killed at Jackson State. And I'm sorry, I think I'd have this down after all these years. And that really pushed me over the edge, that it was time to do more than just protest, than just march with a sign. And I joined the so-called Catholic Left, which is where I met John and Bonnie, and also Bill Davinon. And from there, the next step was the media action.
Keith, could you also talk about how you were invited to join this plan to break in by William Davidoff?
If memory serves, he called me on the phone and asked...
Explain who William Davidoff was.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bill Davidoff at that time was a professor of physics at Haverford College, and I knew him mainly as a fellow activist in the peace movement. He was very prominent in Philadelphia, in both the legal and the illegal peace movements. And he called me on the phone one day and asked me if I wanted to come to a party, which was code for an action. And I believe I said, sure, I'm always up for a party. You can check the FBI transcript, because they were tapping his phone at the time. And so we met at an outdoor location where we couldn't be bugged, and he presented the idea to me then.
And Bonnie Raines, talk about your involvement. What motivated you? You were a young mother of 3. How old were your children?
They were 8, 6, and 2 at that time. We've since had a 4th child. I became involved, as Keith said, beginning with the civil rights movement, and when we lived in New York and were students. Then we moved to Philadelphia, very much opposed to the war in Vietnam, and found a whole community of activists in Philadelphia. We became acquainted with the what was called the Catholic Left at that time, and the Berrigan brothers, Phil and Dan, were the leaders in that. And we participated in with that group called the East Coast Conspiracy to Save Lives in a draft board raid. We went into a draft board in the middle of the night as part of the draft resistance movement.
Where was that?
In North Philadelphia, a draft board in North Philadelphia. We targeted that draft board because it was in one of the poorest sections of the city, where they were bringing many poor young men into the armed forces to be sent as cannon fodder to Vietnam. Our government was lying to us about the casualties, both civilian and military casualties. So I participated along with John in going into a draft board and removing files and destroying those files so those young men could not be drafted.
And you mentioned the Berrigan brothers, the
yes,
priests,
yes.
The late Phil Berrigan, and Father Dan Berrigan,
yes.
who's still alive. Catonsville, how significant in 1969 was this for you? I wanted to go to a clip right now of the Catonsville action. That was Catonsville, Maryland, where a group of activists led by Fathers Dan and Phil Berrigan burned draft cards with napalm. They stole hundreds of draft records and torched them. They were sentenced to 3 years in prison, their action helping ignite a wave of direct actions against the draft in the Vietnam War.
We do not believe that nonviolence is dead, and that we don't believe in interposing one form of violence for another, and that we believe that an action like this will still speak to our fellow Americans and bring home to them that a decent society is still possible, but it's totally impossible if these files and what they represent are preserved and honored and even defended as those poor women tried to.
That was Father Dan Berrigan as they stood around in a circle and burned with napalm being used in Vietnam, draft records.
That was a very dramatic moment for all of us, I believe. It took civil disobedience to another level and really brought us clearly to another level of protest against the war in Vietnam. And we followed their lead in targeting the draft as one of the real evil systems of that war. And that's how we became involved in covert actions with draft boards in Philadelphia.
And John Raines, can you talk about your sense that the anti-war movement itself had been infiltrated by FBI informants?
Oh, sure. I mean, that was obvious for any of us who were involved in the civil rights movement, because it happened in the civil rights movement. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was all over the civil rights movement with infiltrators and surveillance, intense surveillance, and people that would report back on meetings and so on. And of course, we all know that J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI went after Martin Luther King, tried to discredit him, indeed even sent him a note suggesting that because of his activities with other women besides his wife, he now had no option but to commit suicide. That note was sent to Dr. King suggesting, and it was from the FBI, suggesting that Dr. King commit suicide. So that we knew from the civil rights actions that J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI were very much against anything that promised significant social change. We brought that information, that knowledge, north with us when we came to the anti-war movement, and it became clear that the tactics he used to disrupt and try to destroy the protest movement in the South, he was using once again against the protesters against the war in Vietnam. The problem was J. Edgar Hoover was untouchable. He was a national icon. I mean, he had presidents who were afraid of him. The people that we elected to oversee J. Edgar Hoover's FBI were either enamored of him or terrified of him. Nobody was holding him accountable. And that meant that somebody had to get objective evidence of what his FBI was doing. And that led us to the idea that Bill Davidan suggested to us. Let's break into an FBI office, get their files, and get what they're doing in their own handwriting.
You and Bill Davidan were professors.
Yes.
He a professor at Haverford, you a professor at Temple University.
Yes.
What did you feel about the risk that you were taking? Were you concerned about getting caught?
Well, Bonnie and I were parents, and we had 3 kids under 10, and that was a very serious consideration. We had to be persuaded that we could get away with this. And we learned nice burglar skills from priests and nuns. Yes, true. And we'd cased the FBI office and media very carefully.
You thought about Philadelphia, but thought it was too secure.
Oh, yes, it was a big building downtown. You couldn't touch that. But media, you could. And we felt quite confident that if we could get in there and get out without leaving any physical evidence behind, that we could then disappear into the very, very large anti-war movement, thousands of people in the Philadelphia area.
You had prepared in case you were caught to have your children taken care of.
We knew the risks. We knew the jeopardy. We weren't going to be reckless. We weren't going to move ahead with our involvement, except with the leadership of Bill Davidan, who we all had so much admiration and respect for. But we did feel that it was necessary to speak to John's older brother and his wife and to my mother and father about caring for our children if should the worst happen and we would be convicted and sent to federal prison.
Keith Forsyth, you chose the night of the Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier fight to break in. Why? Why was this so significant, March 8th, 1971?
Well, it was just, you know, there were many steps that we took to try to avoid getting caught. And this was one of them. Because whoever suggested it, and I have no idea who it was, thought that it would add to the distraction, not only of the police, but of just people in general. The building in which the office was located had a live-in supervisor, and his apartment was directly below the FBI office. So he was going to be on the next floor down while we were inside walking around opening cabinets. So anything that could keep his mind off of the ambient sound sounded like a good idea.
How did you know that you would find what documents you would find, or did you know?
We didn't know. We were pretty sure. You know, bureaucracies are the same everywhere. They love to keep records. But we were taking a shot. So in that sense, we got lucky that they did keep records.
This brings Betty Medsger into the story, whose book this week, The Burglary, reveals the identities of the activists involved in this burglary. Looks like J. Edgar Hoover found his match in this group of people. Talk about receiving in the mail the documents. You're a reporter at the time for the Washington Post.
Okay. I'd just like to say something about Bill Davidan, if I might, first, that the idea was Bill's. And Bill participated in preparations for the book and the documentary that's been made in 1971. And we should note that we're all very sorry that Bill's not with us. Bill died in November. But he was sort of a genius in coming up with this idea, because although many people in the various movements at that time thought that there were an FBI informers in their organizations, there was no evidence of that, and the public didn't know. And Bill had this deep commitment that if the public could be presented with evidence, they would be very upset, even though Hoover was an iconic figure, that if they knew that there was massive surveillance, of the political surveillance, that they would care and do something, and that's what happened. I was a reporter, and one day this envelope appeared in my mailbox, and it said it was from Liberty Publications. That was the return address, Media, Pennsylvania. That didn't mean anything to me. But when I opened it, there was a cover letter that said it was from the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. That was a new organization to me. And the letter explained that a group of 8 people had burglarized an FBI office on the night of March 8th, and that enclosed were some of the files that they had removed from the office. And some of those files were very shocking. I think the one, and you showed the excerpt from this on the retro report, The first shock, and this also resonated very much with the public when it was published and discussed, was the one that instructed agents to enhance the paranoia and then also make people think that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. And that was a pretty stunning statement and said so much. And the burglars themselves were shocked, I understand, when they found that, saw that document the first night after the burglary. So that stunned me. And I guess the other files, there were many about individuals, and they were all serious. But one of the things that I remember most from those files was the truly blanket surveillance of African-American people that was described. It was in Philadelphia, but it also prescribed national programs. It was quite stunning. First, it described the surveillance. It took place in every place where people would gather, churches, classrooms, stores down the street, just everything. But it also specifically prescribed that every FBI agent was supposed to have an informer just for the purpose of coming back every 2 weeks and talking to them about what they had observed about black Americans. And in Washington, D.C. at the time, that was 6 informers for every FBI agent informing on black Americans. The surveillance was so enormous that it led various people, rather sedate people in editorial offices and in Congress, to compare it to the Stasi, the dreaded secret police of East Germany.
Could you talk about how the editors at the Washington Post responded when you showed them these documents?
The editors responded very positively to them. I should point out that 2 things. First, this was the first time that a journalist had ever received secret government documents from a source who had, from the outside, an outside source who had stolen the documents. So that tended to pose a different kind of consideration as to what you would do in their minds, as to what you do with the documents. But it was a particularly tough decision for Katharine Graham, who until this time had never faced anything like this.
The publisher. The
publisher, Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, because it was the first time that she had been faced with a demand from the Nixon administration that she suppress a story. And she did not want to publish, and the in-house counsel, the lawyers, also did not want to publish. But 2 editors from the beginnings realized it was a very important story and pushed it, Ben Bradley and Ben Bagdikian. I was just back there innocently writing my story, talking. I'd been a reporter in Philadelphia and was talking to sources from the past, confirming information. Didn't know until 6 o'clock that there was a question as to whether or not they would publish. By 10 o'clock that night, she decided to publish.
And talk about the reaction and the reporters who did not get to publish the story, because you weren't the only person that these activists sent the documents to.
They sent them to 5 people. These are the first files that they released. They sent them to Senator George McGovern and Representative Perrin Mitchell from Baltimore. And they immediately returned the files to the FBI when they received them and didn't make them public. They sent them to 3 journalists, in addition to sending them to me. They sent them to Jack Nelson at the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times.
Great crusading reporter who wrote Terror in the Night about the Klan in the South.
Right. And Tom Wicker, columnist then at the New York Times. Now, it's also important to keep in mind, in addition to the fact that we didn't really know, the public didn't know what was happening inside the FBI, that very few journalists ever wrote investigative work or critical comment about the FBI. And Jack Nelson and Tom Wicker were 2 of about 3 or 4 who had up until that point. At the LA Times, Jack never received the envelope, even though it was addressed to him, and it was delivered to the FBI immediately. I didn't know this until years later when I read the investigative report on the FBI's investigation. It's a little less clear what happened at the Times as to whether Tom Wicker received him. What they did do was the same thing. They immediately gave the files to the FBI, but they apparently kept them and copied them, unlike the LA Times, because the day after we broke the story, then they wrote stories on the same files.
Keith, before we go to break, can you talk about parallels to today? It is hard to look at, and for a moment I want to turn to the Church Committee hearings that took place a few years later. Senator Frank Church of Idaho led this investigation. The Senate's Church Committee investigated the CIA and FBI's misuse of power at home and abroad. The multi-year investigation in the mid-'70s followed the exposure of COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program. And it was the first time people had seen that word was in the documents you released. Examining the FBI and CIA's efforts to infiltrate and disrupt leftist organizations, the CIA's attempts to assassinate foreign leaders, and much more. This is Senator Frank Church speaking during one of the committee's hearings.
We have seen today the dark side of those activities, where many Americans who were not even suspected of crime were not only spied upon, but they were harassed, they were discredited, and at times endangered.
That was Senator Frank Church. The Church Committee hearings led to major changes in what the FBI could do, and also dealing with the press as well. You listen to Frank Church, you could be hearing possible hearings today, though they haven't started, to do with Edward Snowden. Right. What are your thoughts on Edward Snowden today?
I think there are some parallels. It's not an exact parallel. But to me, one of the most significant ones is that not long before Edward Snowden released these documents, James Clapper went in front of Congress and the American public and was asked a direct question whether the NSA was engaged in this kind of surveillance, and he said no. Which was obviously a lie. And I think if he had said, oh, we can't talk about that because that's national security, I might have had some respect for that answer. But to come out and lie to the public about it, and of course not suffer any punishment as a result. So to me, Edward Snowden, I've seen no evidence personally that Edward Snowden has released anything that was actually harmful to our national security. You know, certainly has been embarrassing. But to me, the young man is definitely a whistleblower and has performed a great service by enabling us to have the conversation. You know, we couldn't have the conversation about whether this is right or wrong before because we were not told about it. So he's made that conversation possible, and I think we owe him a debt for that.
We're going to break and come back to this conversation. Our guests are Keith Forsyth and Bonnie and John Raines. They were part of what they called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. Activists during the Vietnam War era who broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and took the documents they got and sent them to the Washington Post and other publications to let people know what the FBI was doing. We're also joined by the woman who has revealed the names of these activists, and we'll talk about why they decided to come forward. Betty Medsger, former Washington Post reporter, author of The Burglary, the discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI. Stay with us. Draft Morning by the Birds. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we continue our discussion looking at how activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971 and disclosed secrets about the FBI's COINTELPRO program. That's counterintelligence program. First came to public attention with the release of these documents. We are joined as well as Bonnie and John Raines, who were among those who broke into the FBI office that day, March 8th, 1971, by the reporter who broke the story then and now, release the names of those involved with this break-in. Betty Medsger. She wrote The Burglary, the discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI. We're also joined by David Kairys, who has represented this group until this day for, what, more than 40 years?
43 years.
43 years. But, John Raines, why have you decided to come forward 42 years later?
Well, the simple answer is a book came out. And, of course, that's not accidental. We decided years ago that we would trust Betty with this story. And she's done a wonderful job spending years of research writing a very substantial book. It tells a very interesting story. We decided that it was time to, once again, come forward with the question of government surveillance, government intimidation, and the right of citizens to vocally dissent. I think that the gasoline of democracy is the right to dissent, because wherever there's power, wherever there's privilege, power and privilege are going to try to remove, insofar as they can, from public discourse anything they want to do. That leaves the citizens' right to dissent as the last line of defense for freedom. Now, that's what we were faced with back in 1970s. I think that's what we're faced with once again today. It should not surprise us. I mean, it should not surprise us that those in power in Washington want to make the decisions that really count off stage, out of sight from the rest of us. But democracy depends upon the rights of citizens to have the information they need in order for them, the citizens, who are the sovereigns, for them to decide what the government should be doing and should not be doing. They must have that information so that they can make up their minds.
Explain that moment that night when Betty Medsger came over and you revealed who you were. What year was it?
I think that was 1988. We'd known Betty when she was a reporter there in
more than 20 years ago.
Oh, more than 20 years ago. Betty was then living in San Francisco, but she was on a trip to the East Coast, and we invited her for supper. And Betty was nice enough to say, sure, I'll come. I think it was, we had supper, and finally our youngest daughter, Mary, came down. She was, I think, 12 or 13, something like that. And without thinking about it, I just said, Mary, come on in. We want you to meet Betty Medsger. She was the one that we sent those FBI files to. And Betty's chin dropped down to her chest, and it was out of the bag. That's how it started.
And David Kairys, as the attorney who's worked on this case for so long, could you talk about the significance of the statute of limitations on the case, as well as what you saw as the illegality, what was indeed the illegality of what these documents exposed about what the FBI was doing?
Sure. The statute of limitations, by any fair reading, is 5 years. The FBI themselves closed the file in 1976 because 5 years had elapsed and there was no charges. Excuse me. There are arguments one can make, but there's really no legitimate or good faith basis to bring any legal charges at this point. As for the illegality of the FBI, they're supposed to enforce the law. Here they are interposing themselves as almost a political counterforce to stop certain movements, and it had a direction to it. They were stopping left liberal movements, and they were using techniques that we usually associate with state police in countries and systems that we usually think of as alien.
And how did you come to become involved in the case?
Well, I was regularly doing civil rights work, and I would represent demonstrators of all kinds, and so two of them checked with me before, what's my home number, and Keith kids me that he's still got my phone number from back then on his arm. And so that was the beginning. I didn't know then exactly what they were going to do, but then two of them got arrested in the Camden 28 case where I was lead counsel.
And in fact, remarkably, 5 days before this break-in, Bill Davidon met with Henry Kissinger at the White House, the national security advisor for Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
We don't have time for the story, but we're going to talk about it in our post-show interview, and we'll post online at democracynow.org. How was this secret kept for so many decades? It's not just the two of you, John and Bonnie Raines. There were 9 of you. One person dropped out. There were 8 of you. This is decades later. How did you keep this secret? Well, 100 FBI agents looking for you. And Bonnie, you had gone into the FBI office immediate to case it out and pretend you were a young woman looking for an FBI job and sat with the official there.
Mm-hmm. And did not know, following that there was a sketch that was then circulated of me by the FBI. It was, we
have 30 seconds.
We knew that we had to pull the curtain down, not meet after we did our work, and just not talk about it with anybody at all, because our work was done at that point, and we were not looking for anything more than for the general public and Congress to follow suit in a way that we hoped they would.
Do you feel it accomplished what you wanted?
I think in certain ways it did. We were encouraged when there was a church committee that was taking their task seriously, and there were reforms that did take place.
I want to thank you so much for all being with us, and also thank Joanna Hamilton. Her film 1971 on the same subject is just coming out. We'll be interviewing her. The book is The Burglary. Thanks so much. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we bring you part 2 of this fascinating discussion, the solving of a mystery during the Vietnam War era that wasn't solved till this week. Nermeen?
So we continue our discussion looking at how activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971 and disclosed secrets about the FBI's COINTELPRO program, that is, counterintelligence program.
Until this week, their identities were not known. Joining us are 2 of the people who broke into the FBI's offices, John and Bonnie Raines. John and Bonnie hosted many of the planning meetings for the burglaries at their home where they were raising 3 children. Bonnie worked as a daycare director. She helped case the FBI office by posing as a college student interested in becoming an FBI agent. John Raines was a veteran of the Freedom Rides movement, a professor at Temple University. He used a Xerox machine at the school to photocopy many of the stolen documents. We're also joined by Betty Medsger. She is author of the new book, The Burglary, The Discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's Secret FBI. She first reported on the stolen documents while working at the Washington Post. The activist mailed the documents to her. She was the first to reveal them. The Washington Post, the first paper to agree to publish the information in these documents. She uncovered the identities of most of the burglars in her new book. So 40 years ago, she broke the story, and now she's breaking the story of the identities. And we're joined by David Kairys, who's worked as an attorney for the activists for over 4 decades, a civil rights attorney and law professor at Temple University as well. In the first part of our discussion, we talked about how March 8th, 1971 went down, the night of the Joe Frazier-Muhammad Ali fight, using that as a cover because there would be a lot of noise and the belief that the guards would be watching this in the media offices. But there was criticism leveled, or you feared there would be, John and Bonnie Raines, of why you did this. Because you could have gone to jail for many, many years. You had 3 kids under 10. Professor John Raines, what was your thinking process leading up to this?
Sure, that's a great question. We were the only ones out of the 8 who were not only husband and wife, but father and mother of 3 children under 10. And we were not into being a martyr. We were not into jeopardizing the future of our children. we were pretty sure. If we weren't pretty sure, we wouldn't have, in fact, gone into that office and taken out those files. So we were pretty sure we could get away with it. But the second thing it's important to know is that we routinely ask, as a society, mothers and fathers to take on as part of their work highly dangerous kinds of activities. We ask that of all policemen. We ask that of everybody that works for the fire department. We ask that of mothers and fathers who are stationed overseas, sent overseas to defend our freedoms in the Army and Navy. We routinely ask of people to take on jobs that risk their families. Now, we were faced back in 1971 with nobody in Washington was going to do what had to be done if we were going to reveal what J. Edgar Hoover was doing with his FBI. We were the last line of defense. So, as citizens, we stepped forward and did what we had to do because nobody in Washington would do what they should have done. Then, after we did what we did, people in Washington, with the help of Betty's revealing stories in the Post, then they began, finally, to oversee J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, and things changed.
And you spoke to family members in the event that you were caught and imprisoned. You spoke to some of your family members and asked them to care for your children. What exactly did you tell them you were about to do?
Well, we didn't tell them exactly what we had planned. We did have to let them know the high level of jeopardy and that we were doing this after much careful thought and involved with other people who we thought were responsible and careful. And we asked them if the worst happened and we were convicted and sent to prison, if they would care for our children. So we had that conversation with John's older brother, Bob, and with my mother and father.
When did you tell your children?
It was later, when they were old enough as teenagers to put it in perspective. We've always been a political family and involved our children in political activities of various kinds. But we needed to wait until it could fit into what I describe as kind of the family lore. And it was very easy and very natural to tell them about it. And they were a little bit shocked, but also quite proud.
How did you tell them? Can you describe the scene? Did you actually sit them down together?
I'm not sure. Do you remember it? We waited until they were, I think, teenagers, so that they could understand kind of the larger political context.
But this makes it even more amazing that this secret has been kept for so long. You had 4 children
by that time
that you told, and you're just 2 of the 8. There was also a 9th person. And if you could tell us about him, because he pulled out before the action took place, and you had further interactions with him.
I did. I won't name him, but he showed up on our front door, the door of our house in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. And he said, "I need to talk with you, John." I said, "Well, come on in." And we went in, and he looked me in the eye, and he said, "I think I'm going to have to turn you in."
When was this?
Oh, it was 2 or 3 weeks after the break-in. So, and he knew all the names. I mean, if he had turned us in, we were going to jail.
He was in on all the planning meetings. He pulled out just at the last second.
That's right.
And what did he say when he pulled out?
Well, he said, "I've been told by my girlfriend that there are files that you still have that are highly dangerous files in terms of threatening national security, that name various missile sites, anti-missile sites around Philadelphia and so on." And I said, no, there's nothing like that in these files. Then I said to him, "Well, why did you think there was?" And he said, "Well, my girlfriend and so on." I said, "Have you ever thought that maybe your girlfriend works for the FBI?" And, his face went like that. And then he left, and he kept the secret to himself.
And that's because then it's not only him, it's also his girlfriend who knew. We're talking about 40 years of keeping this secret.
Yeah. His girlfriend, I think, didn't know who we were. I don't think he said that. I think she gave him the information that was false information. It was fed, I think, by the FBI to him, that there were these very dangerous files.
J. Edgar Hoover was desperate to get you. He had over 100 agents.
200.
200 agents. It was your Xerox machine that they were... Well, tell us about the Xerox machine at Temple University that you used to make Xerox. Sounds a little like Dan Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers when he Xeroxed the Pentagon Papers.
Well, back then, nobody knew, or not many people knew, that every Xerox machine leaves its own fingerprint from the drum. Every drum on every Xerox machine has its own separate fingerprint. And therefore, anything that is Xeroxed on that machine can be traced back exactly to that machine. Now, when we found that out, I very quickly, phoned Bill Davidan.
Now, Bill Davidan, meanwhile, is being tapped for other reasons, or for very similar
but
reasons.
He's also using the Xerox machine at Haverford College, and I say, hey, Bill. So he went and he scratched the surface of the drum at Haverford, and
the main reason
David
they
Kairys.
didn't get caught. I mean, you're right. There's all these possibilities. Life is so contingent, and things could be so different than they turn out to be. But the main thing is the FBI used a typical American law enforcement approach. Was instead of looking for who did it and investigating a range of people, they glommed on to one person who they were sure, for whatever reasons, did it. And he was a leader of the Catholic left, John Peter Grady. He had raided a lot of draft boards. They were sure he did it.
He was Camden, New Jersey.
He also did Camden. Yeah, he did a lot of
From
these.
Camden.
Yeah. And they thought that he did it, so they had 200 agents, but they're all looking for the wrong thing. You see, they're all misdirected. And not, they thought there was a locksmith, so they investigated all the locksmiths in the Philadelphia area. They didn't know all you needed was Keith.
We're going to bring Keith Forsyth back in a minute, but he just learned it in a course on, I can't say online because you didn't have the internet at the time, right? Correspondence course.
And he made his own tools rather than go to a store and buy them, which would be a record of that. See, so they were extremely careful, and the FBI just let itself be completely misdirected.
I'd also like to add that
Betty Medsger.
in addition to focusing on John Peter Grady, they also focused on the 9th burglar, and they put him under 24-hour surveillance within 24 hours of the burglary and continued to monitor him for weeks.
The one who didn't do it.
The one who didn't do it.
John just spoke of.
Yes, yes. There were 3 main people that they targeted immediately. John Peter Grady, they thought he was the leader of the group.
And just very quickly explain who he is. His children are well known as activists today, especially upstate New York, taking on issues of drones.
That's right. Well, he was a leader, very prominent within the Catholic peace movement. He was the person in the Catholic peace movement who moved it from the Catonsville 9 method of going in broad daylight and walking out and waiting for arrest.
That was the Catonsville 9 in Catonsville, Maryland, led by Fathers Dan and Phil Berrigan, who burned draft records using napalm that they pulled out of the Catonsville draft office.
Right. And John Grady was the leader of the part of the Catholic peace movement that then took things to another level, which was do these actions, but do them in order to actually do damage to the ability of the draft boards, so that they can't operate and bring people into the service. And get away with it, so you can go on and raid more draft boards. He was the key person in the Catholic peace movement who believed that was needed to be, things needed to be done that way. So the FBI had not been successful in arresting many of the people. There were 350 draft board raids and hundreds of people involved in them. And they had not been very successful at finding these people. And he was somebody that they assumed was involved in many of them. And they immediately, for that reason, I think, assumed that he had led this group. So they focused on him. They focused on the 9th burglar. And they also focused on Bonnie, but they never knew Bonnie's name. They knew her face, and they had that image, that art sketch that had been drawn based on the memories of the men in the office who saw her.
We touched on this in part one of our discussion, but Bonnie Raines, can you describe what you did before March 8th, the day that you all broke into the media office? Talk about your experience.
Well, many of the planning meetings and the scheduling of what we called casing the building at night took place from our house. So I was involved in much of that, but not really one of the prominent members of the group until we realized that we needed to have someone get inside the offices to look at the possibility that there would be security measures, burglar alarms over the doors, whether the file cabinets were locked. So I was elected to do that. And I was to pose as a Swarthmore College student and disguise myself as much as I possibly could and make an appointment to go in and interview the head of the office about opportunities for women in the FBI. And they were very cordial. They spent enough time with me to allow me to really look around to see everything, to gather all the information.
You kept your gloves on.
I kept my gloves on the whole time.
And they
I
never
was
asked
taking
you your
those.
name, right?
No.
You never gave a name.
No. No, they never did. I think in the course of conversation, I was asked where I was from, and I said, I think Hartford, Connecticut or something. But the good news was that I was able to get that last important piece of information about the inside of the office, and then that allowed us to make a decision to actually plan to go ahead with it on March 8th.
So it was from that they got the description of you with these fake glasses and a hat on.
I had long hair, and I tucked my hair all up inside of it. Was February, inside a winter hat, and looked a little shabby, like I might have been a student on a scholarship at Swarthmore. But I was very polite, and they were very cordial, and it went very, very well, and they never noticed that I never took my gloves off the whole time I was taking notes.
And the night of the burglary, what did you actually do on the night, March 8th?
My role, we each had an assigned role, and my role was to be in a car on a side street at the building so that if a police patrol came along on that street and would then turn around to be at the front of the building and might see our 4 fellow companions leaving the building, I was to pretend that my car had broken down and block the street so that they couldn't come around to the front of the building. I didn't have to do that, as it turned out.
And the other people involved, Betty Medsger, some have decided to come forward and some haven't. Bill Davidon, who wanted to come forward, has just recently died. He had Parkinson's. Since you spoke with him a lot, and of course all of you knew him, a professor at Haverford, I was actually wondering if you can tell us the story of his meeting with Henry Kissinger. This is astounding. 5 days. I was talking to his daughter last night, and she said he sort of had a to-do list, you know, meet with Henry Kissinger at the White House, break into the media offices, and steal the FBI documents. That was his to-do list for the week. But how did he end up meeting with the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger?
Yeah, it's an amazing thing to think about, that just 2 days before the burglary, there is the leader of the burglary in the Situation Room of the White House. Bill never missed an opportunity to make the case against the war. And he really didn't want to go to the White House that morning particularly. But an interesting person had set it up. Brian McDonnell was a young Quaker from Philadelphia who immediately after Nixon announced that we were invading Cambodia at the end of April in 1970, Brian came to Washington and sat on the street and sidewalk in front of the White House and was fasting and in protest of what Nixon had done. And he was there for quite some time. And during that time, I remember Shirley MacLaine came to know him and some other people. And they quietly introduced Kissinger to Bryan. And a strange combination, but they actually became real friends, a friendship that lasted until Bryan died about a decade ago. But it was Bryan who knew all parties involved, the three people who came to that meeting, including Bill and Kissinger. And so he asked Kissinger to be willing to meet with them to talk about the war. And Kissinger said, because he liked Bryan so much, agreed that he would. So the three people were Bill and two other people, Tom Davidson and Sister Beverly Bell. All three of them were unindicted co-conspirators in an indictment that had just come down that January that involved J. Edgar Hoover. It was an indictment that charged Phil Berrigan, Elizabeth McAllister, and a few other people. They were indicted, and then there was a series of people, including Bill Davidon, who were unindicted co-conspirators in a conspiracy to kidnap Henry Kissinger and to bomb tunnels under federal buildings in Washington. Now, the Hoover involvement comes the previous November when Hoover, against the advice of his officials, who hardly ever spoke up to urge him to not do something, Hoover went before a committee of two people, and then on the Hill, a congressional committee, and then immediately distributed his statement to as many press as they could get it to afterwards. And in that statement, he announced that these people were conducting this conspiracy, and it was his typical method of trying to convince members of Congress to give him more money, which always happened. But this was a very alarming thing, the idea that these people, priests and nuns and their colleagues, who were known for being nonviolent activists, were planning this violent thing. And the Justice Department and the FBI had investigated this, and the FBI people had decided that there was no plan, there was no real plan, and that the case should be abandoned. And Hoover knew that, but nevertheless made that public accusation. And that was enormous news at the time. And then the Justice Department, again, knowing that there was no such plan, in order to save Hoover's face, went forward with a grand jury and designed it in such a way, eventually in a superseding indictment, that people could be found guilty if they had participated in plans not only to kidnap Kissinger or to bomb tunnels under Washington, but to raid draft boards. If they had done any one of those things, well, they all had raided draft boards. But the impact of it all, of course, on the public was they wanted to kidnap Kissinger or set off bombs. By the way, the case 2 years later failed, and there was no conviction. But at this time, when Bill goes to the White House with two of the other unindicted co-conspirators, they're sitting there with the person that they're supposedly planning to kidnap. So that made it even more strange. And they had a discussion for about an hour in the Situation Room, where many aspects of the Vietnam War had been planned, and something that they were quite aware of. And it was ultimately it was a frustrating meeting where they felt that they were meeting with having a civil conversation with a friendly enemy who at that time was responsible for more bombing. But
interestingly, Kissinger felt he was being smeared. Is that right?
Felt he was what?
Being smeared in the academic community.
Oh, you mean not by them, but elsewhere?
Right.
Oh, yes, that's
part
right.
of why he wanted to meet with another professor, with Bill Davidon, to change the alienation he felt from the academic community that he valued.
Yes, I think that's true, although reading from Kissinger's biography, I think he looked at this primarily as meeting with religious people, as he spoke of their high ideals and being in a spiritual world, whereas he was in the real world, and that they couldn't really do anything, but he had to do something, whereas, in fact, they did not think of it as a religious confrontation or issue with him. They too were very much of the real world and wanted to see negotiations taking place and to stop the war rather than the direction that he was taking it.
And after the break-in on March 8th, 1971, Bill Davidon, whose idea it actually was in fact never questioned by the FBI. Is that correct?
Yes, and that relates to the case that I was just talking about. The FBI was prepared to go after Bill Davidon very, very seriously. And when the Justice Department found out about this, they put out an order that he should not be questioned. No questioning of Bill Davidon, which was quite amazing given his situation and the fact that he was the leader of the group. And that went into effect. And for the entire length of the investigation, Bill was never questioned by the FBI.
Why did they put this out?
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to explain it. Because they prohibited the FBI from questioning him because they were so intent on building a successful case in the Harrisburg indictment, and they didn't want to bring any more confusion into the situation.
The Harrisburg indictment was...
Yes. The Harrisburg indictment was the case of the conspiracy, the alleged conspiracy to kidnap.
It was big national publicity, and Hoover was being criticized for indicting people for a conspiracy that was just ridiculous.
And this would have brought more attention that they did not want brought to
Before we bring Keith Forsyth back in to join his other co-conspirators here at the table, I wanted to ask you, David Kairys, about the legality of all of this. Well, of course, they had broken the law by breaking into the Media Pennsylvania FBI offices. Now the statute of limitations is over, but can the authorities get around that? Say new evidence has been presented. We now know their names.
That wouldn't be a legitimate ground. There are things they could try that, given the way they've been interpreted in law, would just not work. There's really nothing they could do. Now, they do have discretion and a lot of power to put people through criminal trials, even though they're not going to win, the government. So they could, and this is something you have to weigh in a situation like this, they could bring charges and just make you get lawyers and prepare a defense and disrupt your life, try to hold you on bail. There's all those things they could do, but and we would be arguing that it's not being done in good faith because the statute of limitations is run. So I think ultimately it would work out that they are not convicted of anything because of the statute of limitations, but you can't be sure that the government might not make you go through.
The FBI's response today?
Yesterday's statement, I thought, was very positive. I actually had anticipated that they would say something like, we're looking into it, we'll have to get back to you. Instead of that, they almost claim credit for it. It's like things happened that caused reforms, and we like these reforms. So they're just reformers.
That could bode well for Edward Snowden.
Instead of FBI informers, you're FBI reformers.
They also said, I understand, to one reporter, we didn't have very good security.
And this is amazing. I mean, the actual quote of Michael Corton, FBI spokesperson, a number of events during that era, including the burglary, contributed to changes in how the FBI identified and addressed domestic security threats, leading to reform of the FBI's intelligence policies and practices, including the creation of investigative guidelines by the Department of Justice. I mean, this is very significant for Edward Snowden. Because it's saying if what you did led to reforms, then the good outweighed what they would consider the bad of the burglary. Yeah. What does this mean for Edward Snowden? The response has been enormous in terms of calls not only in this country but around the world for reform. David, if you would like to weigh in on that. John, if you would like to weigh in on that. John Raines.
Well, yeah, I think that, that what we were trying to do back in 1971, Snowden is trying to do right now, and that is to give the information that citizens need to decide as citizens what their government should do and should not do. And I think that we faced an FBI with a director called J. Edgar Hoover that was furious at us, and thank goodness we got away with it. Snowden faces governments, especially CIA and NSA, who want to make decisions about this massive kind of surveillance that they have. They vacuum up all our personal information, all of our emails, all of our correspondence. They say that they're not listening to the emails. Well, they've got the technology to listen. Are we supposed to believe that they're not listening to, you know, reading what we're saying on our emails? Anyway, Snowden's facing the same kind of retribution of people of power, and he doesn't deserve that. I see him as a public servant who, as a public servant, did serve the public, giving us the information we have a right to know so that we can instruct the people in Washington what we, the people, think they should do and not do.
The basic similarity in Snowden and the media burglars, I think for those of us who would have never had the courage to do such things, either one of them, and I include myself, they took this enormous risk, a really unbelievable personal risk, so that the rest of us could find out, in this case, what our FBI was doing or to expose wrongdoing. It's the best American tradition to go back to a group that's got a different meaning these days. The original Tea Party was an illegal act. They didn't stand there and say, arrest me for it. They wanted to get away.
And the Underground Railroad.
Underground Railroad, the violations of the Fugitive Slave Acts. The revolution itself, the American Revolution itself, was illegal under existing law. And I still, after 40 years of knowing these folks well, it still amazes me that they took the personal risk that they did, and this is something that, to me, should be praised.
On that note, we're going to reunite those who were involved in the burglary that night. Some might talk about the liberation of these documents, others the stealing of these documents. David Kairys, thanks for joining us. Sure. We're going to be joined now by Keith Forsyth, in addition to John and Bonnie Raines, and Betty Medsger, the author of The Burglary, The Discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's Secret FBI. She is revealing this week in this book the names, the identities of most of those involved with the burglary that night, March 8th, 1971. They called themselves, they with 5 others, the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI, and on March 8th, 1971, they broke into the offices of the FBI in Media, Pennsylvania, and got how many documents, ultimately?
About 1,000. About
1,000 documents. Did you go through them, John Raines, before you sent them off to Betty Medsger at the Washington Post and Tom Wicker of the New York Times and Jack Nelson?
We separated the files into what were clearly legitimate files from our point of view, that is, they involve crime. And we didn't want to release those files because that had names of witnesses and things like that. That was about 40% of those files. 60% of the files were clearly political in intent, and those are the ones that we began to sort through. And we began to find, even on the early morning of the 9th, we began to find documents that were quite exciting.
Like?
Well, like the one that said, let's increase the paranoia and have these folks be persuaded that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. I mean, that's not surveillance. That's obviously intimidation, all right? Intimidation is a political act. It's not an act of an investigative organization like the FBI.
And Betty Medsger, when one of the most damning programs that was revealed in these documents was COINTELPRO. But when you first received the documents, you had no idea what that program was. So how long after you got the documents did you find out what this program was and what it entailed?
Yeah. document that had COINTELPRO on it was just a routing slip. COINTELPRO New Left was a label at the top. We had no idea what it was. None of us who received it had any idea what it was. The FBI was watching to see if that would ever be released, and because I wrote about something that was in that document, they knew as of that day that it had been released and went into high gear. Hoover said, "We'll stop this program." And what he meant was, as he explained to agents, was we no longer use that name. The program continued, but without that name. We had no idea what it was until, thanks to Carl Stern, at the end of 1973.
Of NBC.
Carl Stern was NBC reporter who covered the Department of Justice at that time. And he was in an office of the Senate committee, and they said, "Have you ever seen this?" And Carl had not seen it, and he was intrigued by the fact that at the bottom of the cover of this routing slip were instructions for FBI agents to give the attached article on the need for control of students on campuses who were protesting the war. There was a note asking FBI agents to write anonymous letters and deliver this or mail it to unfriendly administrators, or to just hand it to friendly administrators. And Carl thought, this is very strange. And so within a matter of days, he asked the FBI to tell him what COINTELPRO was and provide documentation of what it was. And they turned him down. He went through attorney generals, various attorney generals at that time, because they were changing as a result of Watergate. And then finally he sued under the Freedom of Information Act. Until then, Hoover had always instructed officials to ignore any applications under the Freedom of Information Act. But Carl pursued this through the courts and won, became the first person to succeed under the Freedom of Information Act in getting anything out of the FBI. And what he received were the documents that immediately became news and explained that these dirty tricks operations had been going on since 1956. They were harassment. They were kind of activities that would seem to have nothing to do with law enforcement or intelligence gathering. Instead, they were secret harassment, sometimes quite violent, and destroying people's reputation.
Give us examples. And again, COINTELPRO means counterintelligence program.
One example is what they did to actress Jean Seberg.
Oh, yeah.
Jean Seberg at that time was a very popular actress, and she had made a contribution to the Black Panthers in Los Angeles, something that, and because the Panthers were under great surveillance, the FBI knew that. And she was pregnant, and the way COINTELPRO operated, agents were invited to submit proposals for these dirty tricks operations, and then the proposal would go back to Washington, and Hoover would read them and decide whether or not they should be carried out. And the proposal was to plant a rumor that the baby she was carrying, that the father of the baby was a Black Panther in Los Angeles. And Hoover was so happy with this proposal, and he wrote a response saying that he thought it was terrific, but he thought that they should wait until she was more noticeably pregnant, wait a few months, so that it would have a greater impact. The plan was to plant the rumor with a gossip columnist. And the people in Los Angeles were so eager to carry it forward that they didn't wait until she was more noticeably pregnant. And what a freelance reporter, Alan Jalan, later revealed in the Los Angeles Times was that the FBI actually planted that rumor with editors of the Los Angeles Times, who then gave it to a gossip columnist.
And they knew they were getting this from an FBI source.
They knew they were getting it from an FBI source, and they gave it to a gossip columnist. She wasn't named, but the description was so obvious that people, especially in Los Angeles, knew, and she knew that they would, I mean, Jean Seberg knew that it was she who everyone realized was the object of this. And the result was quite tragic. She was so upset when this was published in the Los Angeles Times, that she gave birth very soon to a premature baby who died very soon after birth, a white baby girl. And then years later, on the anniversary of the birth of that dead child, Jean Seberg committed suicide. And at that time, Director Webster put out a statement that said, "We are out of this business forever, no more COINTELPRO." But it is a dramatic illustration of how extreme many of the COINTELPRO operations were. And they were all kinds of people, not everyone well known.
I want to turn to Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. He's Institute Professor Emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 2011, Chomsky spoke to Democracy Now! About COINTELPRO.
COINTELPRO, which you mentioned, is actually the worst systematic and extended violation of basic civil rights by the federal government. It's maybe it compares with Wilson's Red Scare, but COINTELPRO went on from the late 50s right through all of the 60s. It finally ended, at least theoretically ended, when the courts terminated it in the early 70s. And it was serious. It started as everything going after the Communist Party, then the Puerto Rican Independence Party, then it extended the women's movement, the New Left, but particularly black nationalists. And it ended up, didn't end up, but one of the events was a straight Gestapo-style assassination of two black organizers, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. Literally. The FBI set up the assassination. The Chicago police actually carried it out, broke into the apartment at 4 o'clock in the morning, murdered them. Fake information that came from the FBI about arms stores and so on. There was almost nothing about it. In fact, the information about this, remarkably, was released at about the same time as Watergate. I mean, as compared with this, Watergate was a Tea Party. There was nothing, you know.
That was Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author, speaking to Democracy Now! Keith Forsyth, could you talk about the significance of what Professor Chomsky said? And also, Noam Chomsky was part of the group Resist, which was one of the groups to which those FBI documents had been sent by you.
Correct. So at some point in the process, after the initial mailing, Bill eventually hand-delivered all of the political documents that we'd selected for distribution to the Resist office in Boston.
This was Bill Davidon,
the
Harvard, yes. And the Haverford professor and well-known anti-war activist.
Yes. And one of the examples that Mr. Chomsky cited was the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, which we all knew about, but we didn't know the extent of the FBI involvement. That came out later. As it turned out, the FBI had an informant in the Chicago Black Panther organization who provided a map of the apartment where the Panther leadership was staying, including a big X on the location where Fred Hampton slept.
Fred's bed.
Fred's bed, yeah, Fred's bed. This map was provided to Hanrahan, I believe he was a district attorney in Chicago, and had a special unit of police whose focus was to target the Panthers. And Fred Hampton was drugged one night and was sleeping very soundly when the police broke in early in the morning, and they killed Mark Clark, and they shot and killed Fred Hampton, excuse me, in his bed while he was sleeping.
He wasn't dead.
Oh, right, that's right.
He was shot, he was wounded, but he wasn't dead. And then his girlfriend, who was pregnant, was in the same room, in the bedroom. Two policemen came in, two Chicago policemen came in, and they said, and she heard them say, well, he looks like he's going to make it. And one of the guys took out his revolver, put the revolver on the back of Fred's head, and blew him away, and said, now he's good and dead.
This was December 4th, 1969, a year and a few months before you raided the FBI offices in media.
And that's the kind of thing that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was involved in. I mean, radically unconstitutional, illegal. Assassination, as Keith said.
Horrifying.
Yeah.
Horrifying.
Later on, there was an FBI document discussing, evaluating this raid. And I no longer recall the exact wording, but it was words to the effect of, the result was very satisfactory. We got the result that we wanted.
You, Keith, had a wrench. You had tools to break in, and that's what you used to get into the offices. 40 years later, Edward Snowden, uses his digital skills in order to get these documents. Do you identify with him?
I do. His skills are far more difficult to master than mine.
How did you learn?
I started with the correspondence course in locksmithing, which I took originally to assist in the draft board raid movement, to try to facilitate getting in and out of draft boards. And then I was actually working part-time as a locksmith on the side in addition to driving a cab, so I got some practice there. And then I practiced quite extensively at John and Bonnie's house, made up a little sort of fake door with a whole 5 or 6 locks in it, so you could, work different ones. And just practiced fairly diligently to try to get the time down. So,
Betty Medsger, can you talk about FBI agent Welch?
Yes. Neil Welch played a number of important roles at that time and was an agent quite different from most FBI agents. While the culture of the FBI was dominated by Hoover's personality, and many offices of the FBI were dominated also by COINTELPRO demands and actions similar to those kinds of operations, political spying and so forth. There were a few agents who didn't like that culture. It was very hard to resist it. But Neil Welch was an agent, a special agent in charge at various places. And he was, I think, the only special agent in charge in the FBI who refused to carry out Hoover's orders that COINTELPRO programs take place. He refused to let his agents participate in them, and at times was placed on probation because of this. A couple things about him later on. First of all, he happened to be the agent in charge of the Philadelphia office 5 years after the burglary, when the statute of limitations expired on the burglary, and it is he who signed the document closing the case. Now, he claims, and I'm sure this is true, that it was a matter of routine. It was time to do that since the burglars had not been found and there was no hope that they would be. I think he was also happy to do so because he, years later, when I interviewed him, told me that although he doesn't think that people should burglarize FBI offices, that he nevertheless thought that these people had done a heroic thing that was very important. And something else that he did that shows the change that took place in the years immediately afterwards. Clarence Kelly became the director of the FBI, the first full director after J. Edgar Hoover. And he came in at a critical time when people in the Justice Department and Congress were first starting to look at the FBI and raise questions. And he at first defended COINTELPRO, later apologized for But at one point, he ordered Welsh to come to Washington, to go into the domestic intelligence files and go through every single one of them and test whether or not they should be held open. Very few were held open. Most of them were closed by Welsh. And that was not reported at the time. It was not known, but it really symbolizes the dramatic change that did take place.
John Raines, can you, what did you teach at Temple University?
Well, I taught Christian social ethics.
Can you talk about the influence of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his significance, who he was?
Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor and theologian, and he spent a year or two at Union Theological Seminary, which is where I would later get my theological training. The Second World War was on, just beginning, and he decided he had to go back to Germany. He would be safe in this country, but he decided that he was not going to choose safety. He would go back to his country where the people were. And Hitler was very much against, of course, this theologian, this marvelous man. And finally, they decided, a group within this kind of religious underground, that they should undertake the assassination of Hitler. And his name was associated with that effort, and he was killed after that assassination failed.
And his influence on your decision to do what you did May 8th, 1971, with your wife Bonnie and the others?
Well, it was an example of one, significant identity with his nation. Two, taking on grave personal risks in order to save that nation from what was happening to Germany under Hitler. And he paid the ultimate price for that. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for that. And that was a significant kind of inspiration for those of us, just like Martin Luther King was also. Taking a risk for what you know to be right, and following that risk, if you have to, all the way to the cross.
And Betty Medsger, his influence on Bill Davidon?
Well, I would just like to say something I learned about his, how both John and Bonhoeffer were influenced in their move toward resistance by African-American people. I didn't realize until I did the research for the book that Bonhoeffer, after he returned to Germany and wrote about his move toward resistance, attributed his ability to decide to resist the government to what he learned here in Harlem from African Americans and about their struggle and their willingness to resist. And when I discovered that, I mean, even his language in describing it was so similar to the way John described that working with African Americans, resisting with them in the South, was what gave John courage to resist.
Oh, yeah. John, I was wondering if you could read the statement you read the morning after the burglary to a Reuters reporter. Now, this was what, March 9th, 1971?
About 5:30 in the morning.
Describe it. Bonnie, what was going on? You were in the farmhouse?
No, we were headed back to our home in our car, and it was early morning. We had decided that the statement that the group had written should be released the very same day, if possible. And so we stopped in our car, headed back into the city at a public phone, and John called a reporter from Reuters, who I think Bill Davidon had arranged that, called him, woke him up, and read the statement to him over the phone.
Okay, the statement is that I read. On the night of March 8, 1971, the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI removed files from the Media, Pennsylvania office of the FBI. These files will now be studied to determine, 1, the nature and extent of surveillance and intimidation carried on by this office of the FBI, particularly against groups and individuals working for a more just, humane, and peaceful society. 2, to determine how much of the FBI's efforts are spent on relatively minor crimes by the poor and the powerless against whom they can get a more glamorous conviction rate instead of investigating truly serious crimes by those with money and influence, which cause great damage to the lives of many people. Crimes such as war profiteering, monopolistic practices, institutional racism, organized crime, and the mass distribution of lethal drugs. Finally, 3, the extent of illegal practices by the FBI, such as eavesdropping, entrapment, and the use of provocateurs and informers. It goes on. As the study proceeds, the results obtained along with the FBI documents pertaining to them will be sent to people in public life who have demonstrated the integrity, courage, and commitment to democratic values which are necessary to effectively challenge the repressive policies of the FBI. As long as the United States government wages war against Indochina in defiance of the vast majority who want all troops and weapons withdrawn this year, and extends that war and suffering under the guise of reducing it, as long as great economic and political power remains concentrated in the hands of a small clique, not subject to democratic scrutiny and control, then repression, intimidation, and entrapment are to be expected. We do not believe that this destruction of democracy and democratic society results simply from the evilness, egoism, or senility of some leaders. Rather, this destruction is the result of certain undemocratic social, economic, and political institutions.
I want to turn to comments that Glenn Greenwald wrote on Tuesday about, Glenn Greenwald is the journalist who first broke the story about Edward Snowden and his NSA revelations. He wrote a piece yesterday, Tuesday, responding to the revelations about the 1971 FBI break-in. Greenwald writes, quote, "Just as it's true of Daniel Ellsberg today, these activists will be widely hailed as heroic, noble, courageous, etc. That's because it's incredibly easy to praise people who challenge governments of the distant past and much harder to do so for those who challenge those who wield actual power today." So, Betty, I'd like to ask you, how were your reports received then? How did people writing in response to the documents, the articles that you wrote, respond to the fact that these activists had broken into the FBI, taken these documents, and that the Washington Post had made the decision to publish them?
Well, the letters to the editors were mixed. I think the majority were positive. People were shocked. They were also glad that that evidence had been presented to them, that they had no idea of what existed. There were others. I mean, this was a time of Cold War attitudes still being very, so there are many people who accused us of being communist and trying to serve a communist purpose by making these documents public. There also was a very strong response among a few people in Congress that the adulation of Hoover in Congress needed to stop and questions needed to be asked for the first time. Very strong effort to press for an investigation. Also, newspaper editorial writers at papers that had only written positive things about Hoover also called for investigations. I mean, that turned out to be a relatively long process, but those investigations did take place in 1975 when there was a buildup of additional revelations, including coming to understand what COINTELPRO was, and then Cy Hirsch's article in December 1974 that revealed that the CIA, in violation of its charter, was also engaged in massive domestic surveillance. That sort of was the tipping point. There was this string of things, and then Congress did. But this all started with the media file release and the reaction.
And you really, in pushing for your piece to be published, you laid the groundwork, though Katharine Graham first didn't want to and then ultimately did, for Watergate, because the same thing was taking place with Woodward and Bernstein, but now she had the experience of releasing your piece.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that there was a build-up of as she became more experienced with this through time, and certainly she was making very tough decisions. I mean, it's easy for those of us who are simply finding the stories and thinking, boy, this is a story there's no way they could refuse to publish, to realize that there were pressures, and in the instance of the press, of the Washington Post, the fact that they owned television stations and the Nixon administration could threaten them with loss of those licenses was a very real thing.
John and Bonnie Raines, so your name is known. Keith Forsyth, your name is now known. What are your thoughts about people knowing who you are?
Well, I can judge most immediately by the things that came in on my phone, my emails and responses from so many people who either read the Philadelphia story or the New York Times, overwhelmingly saying, wow, you did an amazing thing and never talked about it, never shared it all these years, and thank you very much for what you were able to accomplish.
These are your close friends?
These are all colleagues, work colleagues, and I'm hopeful, too, that these are people who will want to see the film as well, 1971, because it's a wonderful documentary and very well done. But it was a flood of responses that were overwhelmingly positive.
And John?
The same.
Former students.
Former students, yeah, and all of them saying, you did a good job, Raines. Thank you for standing your watch.
And how will you deal with the glare of the media spotlight?
Oh, lights are a funny thing. They come on and they go off. And knowing that that's the way lights are, it helps you get ready when the lights go on, knowing that someday they'll go off again. And that's fine by me.
And those who are not named, maybe you could address this, Betty. Someone who is named is Bob Williamson. Tell us what happened with him.
Bob Williamson was a defendant in the Camden trial after the media burglary, and then moved to New Mexico. And Bob has gone through many changes. He was eager to move away from total engagement with the movement as he knew it in Philadelphia and to get on with a new life. And he eventually did that. He was quite happy to recall his memories of what happened and what was a very important experience in his life. He's become a Republican, and it stands in very different position from the rest of the burglars today. But he still looks back on that as a very important thing and regards it as something that caused positive change. And he came to New York yesterday to see the documentary and be with his fellow burglars, and brought his adult daughter to share in the sense of celebration.
I mean, it was fascinating to see him because now he became a Republican speechwriter, among other things, and with his daughter in the audience, he said, I wanted her to know who I was before I was her father.
Right. He's told her about some of the things that he did. I was really surprised to learn yesterday at lunch that he hadn't told her about breaking into an FBI office until they were on the plane leaving Albuquerque on Tuesday.
And Bill Davidan died in November. He knew that his name would become known, but he was not shy about his anti-war activism. He was out there all the way. Why didn't he speak out before? Was it part of the vow you all took together?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes, sir.
It was. That was so important that we were going to trust each other to maintain a silence about it. And I think we knew that Bill would do everything possible to get the word out, but not as one of the burglars. He was very anxious to continue to push for the changes that he thought were so important.
I could say something about Bill and the keeping secrets. Bill's personality was a very humble, modest person while at the same time being a very strong leader. And to some extent, that's a reflection of the qualities of the other members of the group. And one of the things that I think made it possible for them to keep the secret all these years. I've covered a lot of people and a lot of different kind of movements. And there tend to be some pretty dramatic egos in movements of all kinds, where I think for most people, once that 5-year period passed, it would have been very tempting to want to get credit. And I was amazed when I met them and to find out that they did not have that kind of ego need.
Keith Forsyth, before we conclude, how is it for you now that your name is out after all these decades of secrecy?
Yeah, I'm the kind of person that's not really comfortable talking about myself in public, so it's been a little difficult for me. But I was persuaded that by sharing our names, it helps give the story more weight and makes it more difficult for people who may not share our political views to dismiss it out of hand. A book like this with all unsubstantiated sources, unnamed sources, would be, I think, a different book, both as a historical record, which I think is important, and also in terms of the effect it can have to spark a political discussion. So I'm not anxious to be even a little bit famous, but if this will help spur the discussion that we need to have in this country, then I'm willing to do it.
And finally, I mean, what is so astounding about this, and Betty, you touched on this, is when the FBI set its sights on someone, as they did on John Grady, thinking he headed this plot, they're blind to everything else. And maybe that woman they had a sketch of who ended up being Bonnie Raines. But as you show on page 150 of the book, The Burglary, there is a front-page headline, Delaware County Daily Times, a picture of Bill Davidon. This is 5 days after the break-in, with the headline, Davidon Unveils Plot Against FBI. Public remarks by William Davidon about the burglary were reported in a front-page banner headline in a local newspaper, 4 days, that is, after the burglary. As guest speaker at a meeting of clergy in Swarthmore, he read the commission's statement, that's your commission to, Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, explaining why they broke into an FBI office. In those 5 years, he was never investigated for this.
Yeah,
Betty.
That amazing article sort of points to two things. First, the FBI was under orders at that point not to question him. His incredible immunity as a result of being investigated for Harrisburg.
Which protected you all in many ways.
Right, right.
Except for the one who dropped out. That'll teach him. He becomes the suspect.
But it also shows Bill, although I described him as this humble, unegotistical person, he also was so determined that this information become public. And the fact that the office had been burglarized wasn't even getting attention. There were these tiny stories just saying, yes, not much was taken, just a little burglary. And he wanted it to be known that something had happened, and he was willing to go this far, but always standing back, never acknowledging that he was involved in it.
Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. Betty Medsger has written the book, The Burglary, The Discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's Secret FBI. And the activists themselves, professors, taxi cab drivers, director of daycare, who were involved with this break-in. John Raines, Bonnie Raines, Keith Forsyth. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.